Afternoon, Year 12. Welcome to another screencast on metaethics, possibly the most difficult of the topics that we've been looking at in moral philosophy. This is my third lecture on it. And what I'm looking to cover today is I'm going to briefly go through some of the stuff that you should know, but it will remind you for your revision. I'm going to look at the distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. I'll be looking at naturalism and non-naturalism and how you distinguish between those. I'll be looking for how we account for moral progress. I'll be looking at realism and anti-realism. And in this moral progress, I will use it to critique anti-realism. And the specific questions I'll be asking is, should we see anti-realism as nihilistic? And is anti-realism ultimately self-defeating? Okay, so quite a lot to cover today, so listen carefully. Firstly, just to remind you, cognitivism versus non-cognitivism. So cognitivism concerns moral judgments. For instance, the statement, murder is wrong. Well, a cognitivist point of view would say that that is a truth-apt statement. We can actually decide whether it is true or false. We are able to describe the world using moral language. In many ways, you can think about it as being empirical, that you can actually talk about what is going on in the world and you can find out and arrive at a sense of truth. Cognitivism, or non-cognitivism, by contrast, looks at moral judgments and it says that they express attitudes to the world. They cannot be true or false. Some of you will remember A.J.'s boo-hurrah theory, the idea that they can express how you feel about the world, but not tell you in descriptive terms about the world, okay? They do not describe the world as it is. This is a very useful diagram for you, just to remind you. So if we're looking here about language, for instance, yes, moral judgments can either be true or false. That's a form of cognitivism. No, moral judgments have nothing to do with true or falsity, like A.J. says. That's non-cognitivism, okay? Now, to remind you of how that differs from the realist and anti-realist paradigm, realism says, yes, there are mind-independent moral facts. We can go out into the world and find them. And anti-realism says, no, there are no such moral facts or properties. We cannot go out into the world and find these mind-independent facts because they simply don't exist. Now, just to remind you, this is something that we did previously, but a useful piece of revision. If you were to be given the question, explain the difference between moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism, dividing it into two paragraphs. Moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism are two cognitivist theories. That's very important. Cognitivist theories believe moral statements are factual. They are moral facts and they refer to real things in the world. However, moral naturalism believes that moral statements are concerned with natural properties, i.e. psychological properties, which can be tested and have objective features in the world. Utilitarianism is an example of moral naturalism. It claims that happiness in the form of pleasure can be measured empirically, making it factual. You'll remember that that refers in that particular case to Bentham's ideas of the actual felicity calculus. Moral naturalism believes that moral statements are not natural properties, okay? They cannot be measured empirically. So we cannot go out into the world and find them and discover them and measure them. Moral properties may be related to certain natural properties, but that does not make them natural. Instead, moral non-naturalism may claim that moral statements are a product of our rational intuition. And I think the key term there is intuition. Intuitionism, supported by G.E. Moore, is an example of moral non-naturalism. According to intuitionism, moral statements are self-evident and therefore in no need of empirical proof. Okay, now you'll remember earlier when we talked about the naturalistic fallacy that is the work of G.E. Moore, and that's something that we will come back to once again. Another very useful diagram. looking at moral realism versus anti-realism. Here's an exam tip. You need to be clear about the overlap between realism and anti-realism and cognitivism and non-cognitivism for each theory of language you study. See the table above. Okay, so we've got moral realism here, we've got moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism, and then we've got cognitivism here and non-cognitivism. Under moral anti-realism, we have error theory, emotivism, and prescriptivism. And if you watch my last screencast again, I go through these particular three branches of moral anti-realism. And to remind you, that means that morals do not exist as mind-independent entities. They cannot be seen in that way. So I'm taking some of the work now from Mark Dimmock and Andrew Fisher. There's an excellent textbook that you can find on the internet if you want to look. It's simply called Ethics, and I've summarized some of their points here. Now, as regarding moral realism, realism is a view about what exists. It is the view that moral properties exist independently of human beings and can be located in the world. Just as an action possesses properties such as Salika's action, a violent action, or a depressing action, so too it might possess the property of being morally wrong. So it is actually a genuine property that makes up that action. Realism in ethics is somewhat controversial, but realism in geography is far less controversial. And this is where I find Dimmock's example very useful. When a geographer speaks of the water in Lake Ontario, the geography realists believe that such water exists, it has various properties and qualities such as temperature, depth, etc., that it exists independently and objectively. The water would have a particular temperature irrespective of human belief. So you see, again, the water is mind independent, and the qualities that we'd associate with it, such as temperature, etc., would be nothing to do with simply well, I shouldn't say nothing, but are not simply to do with the perceiver. They go beyond the perceiver, and hence they are mind-independent qualities. Analogously, in ethics, realists hold that certain moral properties or facts exist, and they exist objectively and independently of the minds of people. Importantly, realists thus believe in the possibility of error. Believing that murder is wrong does not make murder wrong. What would make murder wrong would be the presence of an actual property of wrongness, objective and mind-independent, associated with that particular murder. Moving on. Moral anti-realism. And anti-realism is simply the denial of realism. Anti-realists deny the existence of any mind-independent, objective moral properties. The moral anti-realist is thus akin to the anti-realist who is skeptical about the presence of dragons or something that we've spoken before, leprechauns, okay? They simply deny the existence of these. They do not see them as objects that exist within the world. Anti-realists tend to be, they don't have to be, non-cognitivists. A fact that should not be surprising given that non-cognitivists do not believe that our moral utterances aim of truth. However, the next section paints the metaphysical map more specifically in respect of how cognitivism, non-cognitivism, realism, and anti-realism might be combined to form specific metaethical theories. So, example theories which are both cognitivist and realist are moral naturalism. We've looked at utilitarianism fitting into that pattern. And moral non-naturalism, e.g. intuitionist accounts such as we've seen from G.E. Moore. What about theories which are cognitivist but anti-realist? Well, that would be Mackey's moral error theory, and I will do a separate screencast just on error theory. Theories are both non-cognitivist and anti-realist, and they are emotivism and prescriptivism, okay? And we've looked at those already, but once again, because this is a complex topic, it's worth recycling this information. Issues for moral anti-realism. Well, the really interesting, and I think this is the bit that you'll enjoy more, is basically moral anti-realism will get itself into quite a lot of difficulty, okay? Because if we take an anti-realist position, we will get ourselves into all sorts of trouble, but anti-realists feel that they're able to answer these, okay? So some of these arise out of the specific criticism made of both emotivism and prescriptivism, but some also arise out of the way we engage in normative ethics, okay? And you'll remember normative ethics is when we're looking for a norm, it's when we're actually looking to prescribe behavior. And the way we may be able to perceive the development of our morals throughout history. Now, this is the key idea. Therefore, while it might be useful to know why emotivism and prescriptivism might fail in themselves, and this is the important point, it is also useful to be able to justify why one might hold moral realist views above those of the anti-realists. Now, let's see why. So, moral subjectivity in history. Many people claim that morality is just subjective. We hear this all of the time, don't we? However, such a view is much more difficult to uphold than many people would admit. For instance, very few people in the world are willing to abandon all ethical principles, especially if they're on the receiving end of something like vindictiveness or malice or torture, etc. So if we adopt the anti-realist point of view, sometimes it becomes very hard to explain why the person hurting you is doing moral wrong. So care needs to be paid to not only to the way morality is employed by human beings, but by the way it is potentially possible to view ways in which human beings may have morally developed. So this is very interesting. Are we going to take the view that many people do, and certainly Enlightenment philosophers do, that reason and rationality and the proper discussion of morals has allowed us to progress and get better in moral terms? Or are we going to take the view that that's not actually the case, and that progress of that kind is a kind of illusion, and that all we're left with would be a world of moral relativism, where we don't have a guide, a transcendental point to talk about progress from? We would expect to see moral disagreement between different societies, peoples, and cultures who may not be at the same level of moral growth. So the question is there moral progress? So why should we believe that there's moral growth? And why would moral growth pose a challenge to the anti-realists, to the people who say that morals are not mind independent? The simple argument for the former is that we reject practices of our ancestors, and we do so not because those practices would not be beneficial towards us. Okay, we're going to look at slavery first. Okay, so if we were looking and I was in the deep south of the United States, I might actually say to myself, well, my ancestors benefited from slavery. I would do better if slavery came back in. But I still don't agree with it, because I want to take a moral point of view which is outside of my self-interest. So if we take this example, it becomes quite difficult to discuss things like moral progress, okay? Now, moving on and talking again about slavery and moral realism. If we think about the United States, for instance, and the Declaration of Independence, which was in support of the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of human beings, we might think, well, it's pretty incoherent to adopt this particular constitution in a country in which most of the people who wrote that document were slave owners. How can we account for this, all right? Well, I suppose we have to say that at the time, the founding fathers of the United States, who espoused this very beautiful sentiment of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, didn't quite realize what those moral ideals meant. So many philosophers argue here the easiest way to explain such a change is that there are certain objective moral facts, and throughout history moral growth has occurred. So to the realists, they would look at the fact that the United States had slavery and that they moved away from it and that there was a huge debate about this, and they would see this as the move towards truth, and they would argue that this is evidence that we can get better at morals. Our morals can become more coherent. But what are two objections to this? One, the objection is that cultures are not isolated, that cultures learn from one another, no culture is really static, and that what we see as moral progress might actually be to do with cultures interacting and feeding different bits of information to each other, thus changing the parameters of the morals, what's considered right and wrong. The second objection is that an important point to make is that simply because there's moral growth doesn't mean that societies or people are always bound to morally grow. And we can see actually that quite often we might find societies regressing and going back. And so this kind of enlightenment idea that we're progressing, etc., can be critiqued. And we might argue in all kinds of societies that some societies have gone backwards and their morals have actually regressed. So, overall, the issue of moral growth does not give wholesale support to moral realism, but equally, it presents difficulties for anti-realism. Because, beyond simply saying there is disagreement about morality, the anti-realist has to show why instances in which it seems societies and people have morally grown, they need to find some kind of alternate explanation, okay, that would fit their anti-realist narrative. So how do we explain these changes, this movement away from slavery, for instance? Well, if you're an anti-realist, the idea is that that becomes a more difficult task. Now, at this point, I would like to draw your attention. I'm going to be posting this video. I would love you to follow this link and to go to your Massillette account and to watch Dr. Luke Elson of Reading University's excellent lecture on anti-realism, on moral anti-realism, and I strongly recommend you do that. For a task which I think would be very useful for you is to answer this question: do you believe that there's been moral progress in the world? If so, is this a sign that there are potentially objective moral facts? And to do this, I would recommend that you draw up a table and you start to think about where's the evidence that you could find that there's been moral progress. And then on the other side of your table, you might equally say, well, you know, there hasn't really been moral progress. So I've started here by saying, you know, that slavery has been outlawed nearly everywhere. And here you might return and say, however, we frequently see human trafficking during the refugee crisis, which we do at the moment. We see people price gouging and selling dinghies to poor people from Africa and Syria who are desperate to leave their countries. So we might equally argue that the moral realist position that there's moral progress is actually a little bit of a tenuous one. So by doing this table, I would strongly recommend that this would help you answering this question. Well, the second part of the question is the evidence then of moral progress, does that help us see that there might be objective moral facts or not? Now I'm just going to move on to the issue of moral nihilism. Now, you know, nihilism is the belief that there really is no objective good or bad, and it's a very strong word. It generally means a kind of anarchism where you don't believe in anything, okay? Moral nihilists deny that human beings should engage in moral practices at all. If this is true, we should no longer speak of things as morally good or bad. We shouldn't even use that moral language. It's not available to us. And in particular, so we can't say that things are wrong or right. And that becomes very difficult because when people are behaving, as I said to you, in a mean or callous or vicious, cruel way, then you can't, that language would not be available to you if you took this position of moral anti-realism. This is an extreme position, though, of moral anti-realism, and it descends, you know, obviously into moral nihilism, okay? So if there are no objective facts, should we abandon the conventional ways we engage in moral discourse? Do we actually say, well, terms like good and bad have no meaning whatsoever? They're simply relative terms that are used by cultures at a particular time. They tell us nothing but the state of play, the conventions of that society. Well, that's a very problematic position to take, but it is one that some people do take. Some anti-realists claim that because there are no objective moral facts does not mean that we cannot continue our current ways of discussing things. So this is a more moderate position. We could still talk about right and wrong, even if we're anti-realists, okay? We have to approach these ethical dilemmas with a few tweaks, however, to account for the moral anti-realist position. However, others go further, arguing for a middle way between moral nihilism and conventional ethics. This is what Mackey, you'll remember, Mackey of error theory, argues, contending that ethics has to be built up again from our understanding of error theory, such that we arrive at new ways and conventions of discussing morals as a whole. So it's quite interesting that Mackey feels as though we will still be able to speak of good and bad, but we do need to kind of go to ground zero and start again. So he, in that sense, Mackey would be rejecting the charge that he's a moral nihilist. So anti-realism, therefore, is a reason to suppose that we have initially adopted a somewhat nihilistic perspective on morality before building on how ethics can survive. Okay. But can anti-realism escape the charge of nihilism? Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, very famous French existentialist, who famously said, existence precedes essences, which basically means that we are born before there's good and bad, and that we invent good and bad. What he's saying is that, as I say here, that human beings are thrown into the world with this radical freedom. So if this is the case, in many ways, such positions seem difficult to argue for without acknowledging that it may be valid to simply do away with ethics altogether, and that if one embraces the radical proposition that there are no moral laws, one should not shy away from arguing it has no relevance to life whatsoever. So this might be quite a devastating criticism of Sartre and that existentialist point of view, which is that, okay, if you're saying that there's no wrong or right, it's not out there, it's not a realist position, it's simply mind-dependent, it's simply invented by the conventions of society, why don't we say that there's no relevance whatsoever? And this is where this charge of moral nihilism comes in. In fact, many accuse existentialism of being nihilistic in disguise and dressing up nihilism in a philosophical kind of disguise, covering it to make it more palatable and more exciting to young people. That's an interesting one for you to think about, and I don't really know how the anti-realist could answer that particular question. Now, finally, are anti-realists therefore in an impossible position? I noticed a little mistake there. Yet, it should be noted that the charge of moral nihilism isn't really a direct criticism of anti-realism. It simply states that the anti-realists can't have it both ways. They can't deny the existence of objective moral facts and then cling on to the conventional ways of discussing things in everyday life. That's a case of trying to have your cake and eat it. For, and this is the really important point, if the very frame of human existence and interaction requires some binding ethical code, then it may be that there is an objective element to morality that is built out of the requirement that human beings have, functioning towards an idea of happiness. And that's the thing. Can we actually have human society without some kind of binding ethical code? And that's what becomes very interesting in this debate. Hope that that was useful. Very complex stuff there, and it will help you, I think, conceptualize some of the differences that we've looked at in cognitivism, non-cognitivism, realism and anti-realism, and finally this discussion of what does moral progress tell us about these different positions. Thank you for listening.